You're listening to Inside Israel Today with Gil Hoffman on the Land of Israel Network.
Hello and welcome to Inside Israel Today here on the Land of Israel Network on thelandofisrael.com. And here we are broadcasting from Jerusalem. I just came back from America where I was on a whirlwind speaking tour of liberal Jewish communities in New Jersey, in Portland, in Eugene, Oregon, where the University of Oregon is, in Los Angeles. And I met with a lot of people who care a lot about Israel, who care deeply about Israel, and are deeply distressed about the issue of the migrant workers that are currently being expelled from Israel. And before I left on this trip, I gave a call to Michael Oren, to an expert in speaking to liberal Jewish audiences in the United States, and I said, what is troubling them now? What do I need to prepare for before I go? And he said, you better have explanations ready on the migrant worker issue because it makes Israel look really bad. And I did my best. I obviously wish I would have done more because it really does bother a lot of liberal American Jews in particular. And so I wish before I left that I had spoken to Dan Eisenbud, who covers the migrant workers for the Jerusalem Post. But better late than never. Here we have him on the line. Dan Eisenbud, thank you for coming here on Inside Israel Today on the Land of Israel Network.
Hi, Gil. My pleasure.
Okay, so you have been covering this phenomenon for a while now since you moved to Tel Aviv. What's it been like?
Well, I think that there are two camps right now. And literally, if you were to look at this in terms of a survey, roughly half the country views these people as legitimate asylum seekers, while the other half views them as quote-unquote infiltrators or worse. The Interior Ministry and the Prime Minister have used terms such as criminals, economic migrants, and they have basically been using a campaign to, the word dehumanize is a strong one, but in this case I do believe it's accurate, to dehumanize this population of 38,000 people. While the other side, particularly people, by the way, who live in South Tel Aviv, Israelis, who live among the Eritrean and Sudanese refugees, myself included, do not blame them or call them infiltrators, and see legitimate, from talking to them, learn that their stories sound very legitimate, and that if they were to fill out asylum requests, they would have to be taken quite seriously. We are talking about Eritrea here, and we're talking about Sudan. These are not, vacation destinations. These are among the worst areas of the world in terms of human rights violations. So the notion that these people are somehow have the luxury to pick a country to try to make a profit where that doesn't even want them is a bit ludicrous. I think that they were just looking for survival. But again, the government is portraying them as economic opportunists and military deserters and just about anything other than asylum seekers. And the numbers show that. There have been 15,000 asylum requests that have been filled out, of which the government has reviewed 6,500 and issued exactly 11 approvals.
Wow.
10 for Eritrean nationals and 1 for Sudanese, which sends a decided message. They're not welcome here, particularly when you understand that 90% of these people are accepted in other westernized countries in their asylum applications for Eritrea, and close to 60% for Sudan. So there's a big discrepancy here.
Okay, so first of all, let's go. You wrote a very passionate piece in the Jerusalem Post on January 9th, where you said that Israel should reconsider its policy on African refugees. And the arguments that you're making now are among them about the difficult situation that there is in places like Sudan and Eritrea. You write that they're a hell incarnate. Wow.
Well, if you were to go there, Gil, I'm sure based on your standard of living, you would find that to be true. These are places where there's epidemics of human trafficking, torture, slavery, forced military service in Eritrea under slave-like conditions that are well documented from a number of human rights organizations around the world. This is not paradise, as I said.
But they're going to Rwanda. Isn't that the Riviera of Africa now?
If it is, I pity Africa because no, their record is not much better, and they already have an asylum epidemic of people trying to get in there. And the anecdotes that we hear from NGOs and from the migrants themselves is that once they get to Rwanda, the money that they are given by the government, which is approximately $3,500, is stripped by the people they meet there, whoever is in charge of bringing them into the country, and they don't get status, and they are forced to leave to find a better place and begin their journey again. So they're once again on the refugee trail. So the Riviera of Africa, no, I don't think so.
Okay, so that's the point of view of the people who are defending them. And now before we get to the point of view of the people that do want them out, there's more extreme points of view. You interviewed Rabbi Susan Silverman, who's basically started a campaign comparing these people to Anne Frank, and which makes Israel look like Nazis, and has signed up thousands of people to shelter the migrant workers and protect them from deportation. Isn't that going too far, Dan?
Yeah, I don't think there's a moral equivalency here at all with the Holocaust. I think that we're talking about refugees. We're not talking about people who have been victimized the way the 6 million Jews were victimized and millions others during World War II. I think that any kind of, and there, by the way, though, there have been Holocaust survivors who have made comparisons, although for me personally, I do not see that. And I do think it's a stretch. However, we are talking about a group of displaced people. There's no question about that. And Jews have, for millennia, been displaced periodically from whatever societies that they thought they could belong in. And I think that is the moral equivalency that people are trying to draw, that this is a nation of refugees, founded by refugees, and that there should be a place for other refugees, considering especially that Israel was among the first signatories of the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention, which
and Israel
basically
took in the Vietnamese boat people when others
right,
did not.
Right. So one has to wonder what is wrong with these people. Why are these Eritreans and Sudanese so demonized in Israeli society? And also at the same time, you have to recognize that Israel has thousands and thousands of illegal immigrants or technically asylum seekers from Ukraine and Georgia. And there's not remotely a campaign that can compare in terms of the rhetoric and the hate speech towards them. In fact, I would argue that most people around the world don't even know this because the focus of the government has been entirely on the African migrants who are in South Tel Aviv.
I can tell you yesterday, I asked Yair Lapid, every week we have meetings of the different Knesset factions, and I came back from this trip where I'd been asked so many times about whether Israel's racist for expelling so many black people, and I wanted to know what I should say. And so Yair Lapid sees himself as a shadow foreign minister who represents the centrists in Israel from his point of view, and he goes around the world defending Israel. So I asked, what do you say when people say we're racist? And he said, well, first of all, we are expelling a lot of Georgians and Ukrainians too, and they're all white. I don't know if that makes it better, but do you think
that may be true? But the government campaign clearly has targeted the African migrant community. You do not hear the terminology used towards the Ukrainians and Georgians, such as infiltrators and criminals and economic migrants, which in most cases they truly are, by the way. Not criminals, economic migrants. Many of them are involved in human trafficking schemes to get better jobs and quality of life in Israel than they would have in their countries of origin.
But they did come illegally. They're illegal infiltrators.
They did.
That's true.
There's no question that they are illegal infiltrators. That's right. But based on the media and based on the focus of the government, again, we are hearing primarily about 20,000 Eritrean and Sudanese nationals who are targeted for deportation. We have not heard much news about the deportation process of the Ukrainians or Georgians.
Do you think it's because of their color of their skin, Dan?
I think that it might have something to do with it, but I think really at the end of the day, what it has to do with is the vast majority of the 38,000 African migrants or asylum seekers live in one ghetto in South Tel Aviv, which is near where I live. And I see these people every day, and they are forced to live together in one area because the government, when they crossed the Sinai to get into Israel, gave them one-way bus tickets to South Tel Aviv, which was historically Israel's backyard. In other words, one of the poorest neighborhoods and one of the most neglected in the country.
Why did you choose
this is
to
where
live
they sent
there?
these people. I live in Yad Eliyahu, which is adjacent to Hatikva, and I moved there because a friend of mine lives there, and these are good people. They don't, it's not. If you were to go based on certain right-wing media reports, you would think that it's, that there's a constant crime epidemic, that there's violence, but it's not the case. These people are peaceful. In my neighborhood are primarily Israelis, but if you were to throw a rock about 10, 20 meters, you're into Hatikva, and that is a ghetto. And then you go near the central bus station.
So I used to go to Hatikva all the time because the Labor Party had briefly moved its headquarters there in order to try to pretend that they represent the lower classes. It didn't really work. But so I remember there the people being Sephardi and poor, and I know that those people have complained about crime and public drunkenness and drugs and prostitution and rape, and that they have to, from the moment it gets dark, they never leave their house anymore. They're scared. Yeah,
I've heard the same stories, Gil.
You can understand why they don't want to have these people as their neighbors.
Yeah, but the one thing you have to understand is that this predates the Eritrean and Sudanese presence here. South Tel Aviv was always like this. There was always horrible crime levels. There was always prostitution, drug abuse, public drunkenness. This is the lowest socioeconomic class in central Israel, or among it. And there was never a time where South Tel Aviv was thriving. So basically what happened was when these people began to trickle into the country in 2006, and in earnest between 2012 and 2014, they were all placed in this neighborhood, which exacerbated whatever problems already existed. Now, there's no question that there is an epidemic of alcoholism among these people, which would probably result in public drunkenness. And there is a degree of infighting between them. However, in terms of crimes against Israelis, it's marginal at best, and there is no indication or data that they are somehow a menace to Israelis themselves.
So
perhaps among
just
themselves.
To give the other point of view here, when Ehud Barak was the prime minister, and he's the one who moved that Labor Party headquarters over there, he poured a lot of money into the rehabilitation of South Tel Aviv, and it was seen as a gentrifying, recovering neighborhood that people had actually started moving into, and people there had new hope. Those were seen as the glory days.
I think that my neighborhood, which is Yad Eliyahu, which is South Tel Aviv, is among the neighborhoods you're speaking of. There are parks here. I do not live in the midst of the ghettos where the majority of the refugee seekers live. I live, several meters away. So it's the equivalent of, if you live in New York City, I would, in the Upper East Side, you have Harlem right next to the Upper East Side, So I wouldn't say this is as nice as the Upper East Side, but I live next to, without question, poverty and all the other issues that we were discussing. So there are areas in South Tel Aviv that have probably been revitalized, my neighborhood included. However, if you go towards the central bus station, you are going to be seeing a microcosm of the worst of the worst, which is basically thousands of people who are just struggling to get by with endemic drug abuse, alcoholism, and prostitution because they're desperate. But the notion that these people are somehow a menace to Israelis themselves, that they are, predators, is just false. They tend to keep, based on my interviews and my observations, they have their problems are internal, not external.
Interesting. Now, even though you wrote that passionate piece, you are a news reporter who is covering the phenomenon day in and day out. If you had to make the case of why these people shouldn't be in the country anymore, what would you say?
I would say that if they are, in fact, economic migrants, if that can be proven, I have always said that if the Interior Ministry would just simply review all of their asylum applications, which they have not, and give them a fair shot and to determine whether or not they are, in fact, refugees or opportunists, that's all that needs to be done at this point. Just due diligence and a fair shake at telling their story. That's it. It's a very simple solution as far as I'm concerned. Review their asylum requests, which the government has not done, and in many cases, out of hand, has rejected. I think once that's done, I think that if they get the manpower at the Interior Ministry to get enough people to review all the asylum requests, just like any other civilized country would do, and Israel is the sole democracy in the Middle East, I think it's incumbent upon Israel to take this seriously and to review each and every request. And if they have good reason to believe that these people are, in fact, not refugees, they can send them on their way. However, even in that case, they should be sent to a third country that is reasonably safe, and not Rwanda or Uganda. And if they are, in fact, refugees, which I imagine a lot of them truly are, they should be given refugee status and protected.
Okay. I appreciate your time, and I'm going to deal with the issue more after the break. Thank you very much for being a part here of Inside Israel today on the Land of Israel Network, on thelandofisrael.com.
My pleasure, Gil. Thanks.
That was Dan Eisenbud, who's been covering the African migrant workers for the Jerusalem Post for quite some time now, after moving from Jerusalem, where he covered Jerusalem for the Post, to Tel Aviv. I gotta tell you, listeners, this is a very complicated issue with a lot of people who feel very passionately on both sides. And I think that Dan has explained very well the point of view of the people who want to give these people a chance to stay. And the government of Israel has a different policy. And when I was on these trips, I had to explain the government's policy. It's part of what you do when you're on a speaking tour. And it was a challenge because there are people who feel very, very upset. There are people who told me that they are passionate Zionists and that they are worried that Israel has become racist, and it's made them quite upset. And so I was challenged to speak to these people and find out what can be said in order to explain the situation better. And I tried various things at first that I think really didn't work. I told them it was a choice among different evils, and Israel handled it better than most places, but it could have handled it much better. I spoke about a Knesset committee that I covered years ago, where workers testified, and they said the migrants are willing to work 16 hours a day for half of minimum wage. And because of that, Ethiopian Jews who came to this country legally and are Jewish are being fired. The employers have said, well, why would I employ someone who I need to pay minimum wage and will only work 8-9 hours a day when I can have these migrant workers work for 16 hours a day and I don't have to pay them that much. That didn't really work with the people who I was trying to persuade. They said willingness to work like a dog for next to nothing isn't a compelling reason to exile anyone. So I kept on learning more and trying to figure out what to say, and came up with a few things, and you can think about them for yourself. Number one, we're not dealing with refugees. If the people who are from Darfur are going to stay, those people are refugees. For a long time, Sudan was at war. It is currently not at war. Eritrea has been at war at times. They still have an army that takes men for an extended period of time. There are countries in the world that deem countries where there's a mandatory draft as places that its people are refugees and you can't return them. Israel, which has its own mandatory draft, does not have that rule. And so according to Israeli law, neither the people from Sudan nor the people from Eritrea are refugees. If they're from Darfur, they are. Darfur is an area of Sudan where the people are still deemed refugees. Those people are staying. Anyone who is married, certainly people with kids, are staying. No women are being deported. No children are being deported at this time. They are expelling single men who have not laid down roots. Had this been a small amount of people, then there wouldn't be this big effort. But it got to be, as Dan said, tens of thousands of people who came over the border from Egypt illegally looking for work. One of the first things that Netanyahu did when he returned to office is build a fence on the border between Israel and Egypt. It's a long border, so it wasn't cheap, but it was a relatively simple thing to do. And so you haven't had migrant workers come. So on the one hand, we are saying that these are people who have not laid down roots, but yes, they have been here for a while because they came before that fence was erected. They are being given money. They are $3,500 in order to have what to live on when they move to wherever they would be, whether it's Rwanda, Uganda, anywhere else. They're being given a couple days in a hotel, I was told. There's follow-up with them to make sure they're okay. And that's certainly steps that have not been done by other countries that have been a lot more cruel to their migrant workers who they've expelled. Donald Trump's administration has really gone to war against the phenomenon of people who've come into the country illegally. They have not hesitated to expel children, which looks really bad. There are Israelis who entered America illegally, and their children are being deported. It's happening. There's a case in California that I read about in the local newspaper in Hebrew of Israelis when I was there, of a student at San Diego State who went across the border to Mexico by mistake, got off the highway in the wrong place, and when he came back, they didn't want to let him back in the country. They put him in jail because his family entered the country illegally. When he was 7, he's now in university. Donald Trump's administration shut down the government over this particular issue, or Congress more accurately. In the European Union, there are countries that have taken very drastic steps after welcoming the migrant workers and now are banishing them. The United Kingdom England left the European Union, is in the process of it with Brexit, because of the liberal policies of the European Union on accepting migrant workers. And so there's your could have been worse factor. People that are seeing this as a humanitarian issue should really feel bad for the people who were living in South Tel Aviv, and the neighborhood was getting better. And the Ethiopians and other poor people whose jobs were taken away, they're a humanitarian issue as well. And the people who've made this so extreme by comparing these people to Anne Frank, I think hurt their cause. Anytime you bring in the Holocaust and compare people to the Holocaust, that's something that turns a lot of people off. There are security reasons. You don't want to have your border be porous, and there are people who, God knows what kind of military training they had in other countries. Israel has to worry about its security. There are demographic issues. Look, a lot of the people who right now are trying to pressure Israel to not expel so many of these people, they're the same people who want Israel to create a Palestinian state immediately because they want Israel to remain a Jewish state. And they believe that if Israel does not create a Palestinian state very soon, then there will eventually be an Arab majority between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And then the Arabs there will not have an interest in there being a two-state solution and will take over our state and make it Arab state number 23 and Muslim state number 58. So if you care so much about demographic reasons that you want to give up a lot of land and create a state that could very well become a failed state, a terror state, an ISIS state, you got to be thinking about why you want to keep a huge number of non-Jews in this country. Those demographic reasons apply, of course, not only to African migrant workers, but to Georgian migrant workers and to Ukrainian migrant workers and Filipino migrant workers who've also come into this country, people from Thailand working in agriculture, people from the Philippines who are working in caregiving to the elderly. In the end, with this issue looking really bad for Israel and Israel looking racist, which it's not, I don't believe for a moment that the people who've made this decision to expel these people did it because of the color of their skin. I think what can maybe balance this issue out is what's going on in the Arava. In the Arava, which is a desert area of Israel, there is a program that trains people from third world countries in agriculture. And it's fascinating. I got a chance to visit this program. It's being funded by the Jewish National Fund. It's a school that takes people in from countries that are third world and that teaches them sustainable agriculture. The Center for Sustainable Agriculture at the Arava Institute for Environment. The center is dedicated to the investigation and preservation of arid lands and their natural resources, and it works collaboratively with leading institutions, including the Ben-Gurion University. And what it's doing is it's teaching people from these third world countries the methods that Israel has perfected that can help employ a lot of people, take desert land and allow it to grow crops. And this results in thousands of people in third world countries being able to have food. I thought it was very impressive when I visited it. This is helping African people who happen to have black skin as well. So if we're such a racist country, then why are we doing this? I'll leave it at that and let you all think for yourself about this very controversial issue that is in the heat of the news right now inside Israel today. Thank you for being with us here, and we'll tackle another controversial issue here next week from here in Jerusalem.